This presentation is an introduction to the core components of the deaf and hard of hearing special education eligibilities. In this presentation, we will hear about the definitions of deaf and hard of hearing from both the federal standpoint and the state. We'll see types of hearing loss, the initial evaluation process, as well as the annual reviews that need to occur. You will see information about the expanded core curriculum that applies specifically to students with the deaf and hard of hearing eligibilities. And we will see the unique needs related to writing IEPs for these students, as well as useful accommodations that are specifically pertinent to these students. There are several acronyms that you will see throughout this presentation. The first few here are specific to the deaf and hard of hearing eligibility. DHH for deaf and hard of hearing, ASL refers to American Sign Language, and the ECC is the expanded core curriculum. You will also see ESOL, ELL, IEP, GAA, OHI, SLP, and IDEA. According to IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, deafness is a hearing impairment that is so severe that the child is impaired in processing linguistic information through hearing, with or without amplification, that adversely affects a child's educational performance. Hearing impairment refers to an impairment in hearing, whether permanent or fluctuating, also adversely affecting the educational performance. You see the differences between these two are marked in bold. In deafness, the specific impairment is in processing linguistic information through hearing, whereas in hearing impairment, this may be permanent or fluctuating, but it doesn't specifically mean that the child has difficulty processing linguistic information. They may just have difficulty hearing as well as other students. Okay, you'll notice on this slide that the Georgia Department of Education adds a couple key things to their definition of deaf and hard of hearing. To define a child who is deaf, the Georgia Department of Education specifies that it means they cannot hear between 66 and 90 decibels, whereas a child who is hard of hearing cannot hear between 30 and 65 decibels. This definition is likely to change soon, probably within the next year. They're looking to change it. And actually, what's probably going to happen is that they're going to remove these two additions altogether. And that is to ensure that any child with hearing loss can receive services. So, right now, if you have a child who is just a little bit out of range of these specific numbers, then they automatically are not able to receive services. And so this leaves out children who do have a degree of hearing loss and who would benefit from services. And so by dropping these definitions in order to better match the IDEA's definitions, we'll be able to serve more students who have needs in hearing. There are approximately 11 million people in the US who are either deaf or hard of hearing, and 90% of these people are born to hearing parents, which creates additional difficulties for the family in order to teach the child to communicate, in order to communicate with the child. There are two kinds of hearing loss, conductive and sensorineural. Conductive hearing loss is caused by damage or impairment to the outer or middle ear, which prevents the sound waves from reaching the inner ear, so that means that they can't hear. In the sensorineural hearing loss, it could be caused by damage to the hairs of the cochlea in the inner ear, or it could be caused by some sort of problem with the nerve pathways getting the sound to the brain. If it's a problem with the nerves, a cochlear implant may be used, and this bypasses the damaged cells in the ear and it sends the electrical signals to the brain, where they are then interpreted as sound. There's a lot of difficulties with the cochlear implant, and particularly within deaf culture, as to whether or not people want to get it or don't want to get it. And so some students who are deaf may have the cochlear implant, but even with the implant, they are still considered as having a hearing disability, and they will still receive services. A student could also present with a mixed hearing loss, which is a combination of both types. Any child that presents with a suspected hearing loss must be evaluated by an audiologist. The audiologist will reevaluate these students each year to document progress, use of technology, and anything else that's going on with their hearing. In addition to the audiological reports, these students must have an audiological evaluation. This doesn't have to occur with the initial eligibility, but it has to be completed within 90 days of the eligibility being completed. In the audiological evaluation, they will look at the outer ear, they will look inside the ear, just to see if there's any sort of physical cause that could be contributing to the child's hearing loss. Additionally, a psychological evaluation will need to be done. This includes using appropriate instruments for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. This may mean getting a ASL interpreter if the student is able to communicate in ASL, and it is likely that all of the parts of the psychological evaluation will not be able to be completed due to the hearing loss, but as many parts as can be completed need to be done so that you can have a fuller picture of the child. Additionally, all of the comprehensive educational assessment pieces must be conducted as well, the academic, the language and communication, the social and emotional piece, as well as observations of the classroom functioning. And these need to be done with kind of specific attention paid to how the child's hearing loss affects their, relationships with peers, how they are able to function in the classroom, just to see specifically how the hearing loss affects them. A deaf and hard of hearing teacher must be included as part of the evaluation process. So as soon as you identify a student as potentially having a hearing loss, you get the audiological evaluation and you get in touch with the deaf and hard of hearing teacher to kind of guide through the process and to make sure that everything is accommodated to the child's needs. Important to note is that if you have a student who is deaf or hard of hearing, you cannot serve the student under OHI or other health impairment. They have to be served under the deaf and hard of hearing because there are kind of specific components that go along with that eligibility that need to be maintained. So in addition to having the audiologist assess the child at their initial eligibility, the audiologist must also reevaluate the student every year. This has to be a certified and licensed audiologist, and they can evaluate the student more than once a year if they feel it's necessary. The audiologist will also do an otological inspection with an otoscope. They'll look inside the ear to see if there's anything that's changed. They will do different types of hearing tests, the unaided and aided pure tone, speech audiometry, intermittence testing, word recognition. These are just different types of like hearing tests. And if the student uses any sort of technology, such as a hearing aid or the frequency modulated system, which is a kind of hearing amplification system, if the student uses any of these, the audiologist will look at the stuff, make sure it's working right. They'll work with the student to make sure that the student understands how to use it. And then finally, the audiologist will interpret the results and kind of write up a summary of how the results of the test apply to the child in his or her classroom setting. Now, you might ask why a student with hearing loss or a deaf student would need a comprehensive evaluation if, being deaf seems like the obvious qualification for special education services. But it is important to note that just because a child has a documented hearing loss, they don't necessarily qualify for special education services. It must be that the hearing loss has an educational impact, just like with any disability that a student may have. There must be evidence of an impact on the educational performance, or the child must need services in order to maintain their educational performance. The audiological report is used to determine if there is an identified disability that the child has, but that alone is not going to qualify the student for special education services. The educational assessment portion of the eligibility is what will actually qualify the student for special education services. Additionally, when we're looking at end of the year testing, a deaf or hard of hearing eligibility does not qualify a student automatically for the GAA unless there is a concurrent intellectual disability. When completing a comprehensive evaluation for a child with suspected hearing loss, you should include the auditory functioning in multiple environments. And so you want to look at how well the child is able to hear in the classroom, on the playground, in the hallway, when they're just kind of talking with their friends on the playground, or if it's in a quiet space or a loud place. You want to get kind of a good picture of how the hearing loss affects the child in different situations. It should also include information from all the members of the team. This could include the interpreter, if there is a ASL interpreter, the student's family, the student themselves, teachers, speech therapists, the psychologist, anybody that works with the child should be able to provide some information on the child's functioning. Interpreters and the family members can often provide helpful information about the student's use of language. And so you could have a student who has a little bit better language usage at home than at school, or vice versa. And it's important to kind of understand how the child uses language in all situations. And also, it's very important when you're thinking about what the child's mode of communication is going to be, because for some children, they may have enough hearing that they can develop some speech and use some verbal language. You may have students who will probably never have any hearing and will be communicating completely in American Sign Language. And it's important to speak to the family to see what are their thoughts for the child's communication mode and what are their ultimate goals for the child in the area of communication, because you want to make sure that you're all on the same page and kind of working towards the same goals. You also need to consider the students functioning in the classroom and with peers related to kind of self-advocacy and social skills. When you have a child who is deaf or hard of hearing, that's going to potentially cause some social issues where the child will have to explain their disability in order to interact with people. People will ask questions, and we want to make sure that the kids can kind of navigate these situations appropriately. And this also becomes important when we look at the expanded core curriculum, because there are goals specifically within that curriculum to address these needs. Now, onto the expanded core curriculum for deaf and hard of hearing students. The expanded core curriculum is also used for students with visual impairment, and it's not something that all special education teachers necessarily use a lot, but it is something that becomes very, very important with students who are deaf and hard of hearing. So the students with deaf and hard of hearing eligibilities will have disability-specific needs that change as they get older. This also means that they should not be dismissed from special education, even if they seem to be performing well academically, because as they age and especially as they transition to adulthood, they're going to have specific needs that need to be addressed with their college goals or career goals, and just being able to navigate the world with a hearing impairment. And so special education and the expanded core curriculum is designed to help students with these disabilities navigate that future. The expanded core curriculum addresses both these specific needs and the maintenance of skills throughout their school years inside the classroom and outside of the classroom. So these aren't all just academic skills. These are a lot of life and functional skills that these students will need to have. The goals that relate to the expanded core curriculum are the goals that the deaf and hard of hearing teacher will write and monitor and work with the student on. So the deaf and hard of hearing teacher is not responsible for academic goals. That's the special education teacher. And so the deaf and hard of hearing teacher is only responsible for these kind of expanded core curriculum goals that are meant to address the unique needs of these students. These include several different types of goals. The first are audiology goals. This includes understanding their hearing loss, being able to explain it, being able to kind of navigate the environment in relation to their hearing. Career education, this becomes especially important as we start looking at older students and transition to adulthood. Planning work skills, job seeking skills, money management, things that they will need special help with as they grow older. The expanded core curriculum also addresses communication. This is the development of auditory skills if the child has some hearing, the development of ASL if that's going to be the child's mode of communication, speech development if that's something that the child will be able to do, as well as receptive and expressive communication, so just how the child is going to communicate and be communicated with. The next one is family education. As you saw on the earlier slide, 90% of deaf children are not born to deaf parents, and so the families may have no idea how to instruct their child in communication. They might not understand hearing loss or the resources and technology available to them. And so part of the expanded core curriculum addresses families specifically in order to help them navigate their child's disability. The next is functional skills for education. This is specifically focused on the classroom, the development of study skills, organizational skills, helping them kind of put content together. This is especially important because students with hearing loss spend a lot of their kind of mental resources just trying to understand the communication that they miss a lot of the organizational stuff. And so the deaf and hard of hearing teacher will work with the child on how to, take notes, how to put their work together, how to keep organized, things like that that the child might be missing due to, either watching a sign language interpreter or, trying to, work with their technology to just hear what's being said in the classroom. The next one is self-determination and advocacy. This is teaching the child how to advocate for themselves and their needs, how to get access to the resources that they need in the community, awareness of the deaf culture, how to access interpreters and different resources that they may need in the community. The next is social emotional skills, and this also kind of goes to self-determination, self-awareness, self-management, making good decisions, interacting with others, conversation skill, conflict resolution, things that will be particularly difficult for the child because of their disabilities in hearing. They're not going to be able to um, communicate with most people the same way that you and I do. The final one is technology. Um, we're going to look at another slide about different kinds of technology that are used for deaf and hard of hearing students. These kids need to learn how to use their technology, when to use it, how to take care of it, how to use it appropriately, and these are all skills that have to be taught. An IEP for a deaf and hard of hearing student is not much different from a regular IEP. There are, a few more people involved and a few things that you particularly have to focus on. You'll have the case manager, which is usually going to be your special education teacher. This teacher will write the IEP just like we do. The deaf and hard of hearing teacher is a service provider and will focus on the expanded core curriculum goals. The audiologist is a related services provider, and the audiologist will, see the child throughout the year, and each year is responsible for doing an evaluation on the child as part of the IEP process. If the student uses ASL, then you'll have an interpreter as a additional related services provider. And just like with any special education student. Other service providers may be needed as well. You might need a speech therapist, you might need an occupational therapist or a physical therapist. It just depends on the needs of the child, but the deaf and hard of hearing teacher and the audiologist and potentially the interpreter are additional people that you might have on your IEP team. When you get to the special factors section of the IEP for deaf and hard of hearing students, you have to consider these special factors specifically on how they are related to the hearing loss. When you look at behavior, in addition to any like problematic disciplinary sort of behavior problems, you might have a child who doesn't want to wear their hearing aid or to use their hearing devices. And if you have a child who has hearing loss and they're not using their devices, they're not going to be able to access the curriculum. And so you can actually write a behavior intervention plan to address these kinds of student behaviors. It doesn't necessarily have to be kind of a it's not a punitive sort of behavior intervention plan, but it's to address behaviors that are impacting the child's learning. And if a child is not wearing their hearing aid and they need their hearing aid, then a behavior intervention plan can be put into place to help the child to be able to use that more consistently. You can also use the behavior intervention plan to create like backup plans for instruction. If the child, say, leaves their hearing aid at home on purpose or accidentally, you can have a plan in place. So, like, what are you going to do if the kid comes to school without their hearing aid? You're still going to have to provide instruction that day, and so you need some sort of alternative to address the child's education in the absence of the technology that they need. If you have a student with limited English proficiency, then you may have to assess the child for ESOL, uh, but you have to be very careful when you're looking at English as a second language for students who are deaf or hard of hearing. Students who use American Sign Language just should not be screened for English language proficiency because they are not learning English. They're learning American Sign Language, it counts as an English language, and so they're not learning English as a second language. And students who have an identified hearing loss, if you feel that they need to be screened for English language proficiency, they need to be screened with an ESOL language specialist who can identify an English language learner. And this should only be done after the IEP is in place. So if you have a deaf or hard of hearing student, you should never send them for a ESOL evaluation until you have their IEP in place. And that's to make sure that as a part of the ESOL evaluation, they can have the appropriate accommodations and that you can make sure that the language test is actually assessing language, which is going to be more difficult in a student who has hearing loss. If you do have a student who is deaf and hard of hearing that is identified as an English language learner, this has to be reevaluated each year with the IEP, and with an understanding that you will never be able to test them out of ESOL because there's domains in the testing that they'll never be able to perform in because they can't hear. And so you have to be very, very careful when you're putting deaf and hard of hearing students into an ESOL program because it's just really difficult to assess and it's difficult to monitor as well. Under special factors, you also need to include in the communication portion what opportunities this child has for direct communication, for personal communication with like friends and family, for opportunities for direct instruction in communication, like does the child have a time to work with a sign language instructor to get better in sign language? And also how the child's communication functions in different settings, you know, classroom, lunchroom, playground, they go to different classes, as well as information on their communication forms. Do they use ASL? Do they lip read? However the child communicates, that needs to be documented in the communication section. And finally, assistive technology. This can include hearing aids, the FM transmitter, if they use closed captioning in the classroom or noise buffering tools. Any kind of assistive technology that they use can be included. It's best probably to describe them as hearing assistive technology because that kind of covers all your bases. So no matter what kind of technology the child specifically uses, if you mark it down as hearing assistive technology, that'll cover all the bases. And it will also make it easier if the child changes to a different kind of technology, or maybe they have a couple different forms that they go back and forth between. And so just to kind of cover the bases, if you use hearing assistive technology, that will allow some flexibility. At the bottom here, you see a link, and that's just specifically Georgia Department of Education resources for English language learners. And if you click on that, you can find information specifically related to English learners who are deaf or hard of hearing. So finally, you'll see some useful accommodations for deaf or hard of hearing students. Some of these are the same accommodations that we would give to um, students with other disabilities: extended time, preferential seating. And the preferential seating is important because the child needs to be kind of close to the teacher, especially if they're trying to read lips. Shortened assignments because it takes longer to understand the content and what's being said if you're having to go through an interpreter or if you're having to use some sort of technology. The shortened assignments will make the work a little bit more accessible to these students. The use of digital and assistive devices. This includes the FM transmitter, hearing aids, and if it's determined that a child needs one of these devices in order to access the curriculum and the family either cannot or will not provide it, then the school is responsible for providing this technology if it's, like I said, determined that they need this to access the curriculum. If a child has an interpreter, an ASL interpreter, one accommodation will be extra time to watch the interpreter. And so the teacher will speak and then the interpreter will interpret. And so there needs to be enough time built into the classroom for the interpreter to relay the information to the student without getting behind on what's going on. The teacher also can be asked to wait for the student to face him or her, and this is important if the child is trying to lip read or if they're just hard of hearing, because looking at the teacher is going to make them be able to hear what the teacher is saying a little bit better. And so if you have a child in your class who is deaf or hard of hearing, you need to make sure that you only speak to them when they're looking directly at you. And finally, captioning. There are pretty cool captioning devices that you can just speak into, and then if you have a screen, it'll print the words on the screen for you. And so a student could use this as technology in the classroom. If you're interested in more information about different assistive devices for people with hearing loss, you can click on that link on the bottom of the screen there, and it's the National Institute of Health will explain in a lot of detail the kind of uses of assistive devices and the different kinds. All right, finally, here's just a few more links if you want some more information. The first one is the Georgia Department of Education's link to their deaf and hard of hearing information. You have the director of the deaf and hard of hearing for the state. Her link is on there, and then all the information that you have about testing, information about the extended core curriculum is on there. The next one is the National Association for the Deaf. And after that is the National Deaf Education Center. And this is kind of like the main place to go if you're looking for issues on deaf education or like schools for the deaf, the Laurent Clerc National Deaf Education Center. And finally is a link to a TED Talk where they're just discussing how to make education accessible to deaf children. All right. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.